you're entering into the sacred. And you know what? That brings a lot of joy when you're there, but it also it gives you the grace to move on in your life, to go forward with things maybe that you're struggling with or petitions that you bring with you. So there's lots of great graces when you go on pilgrimage.
All right, Mary Hanbury, we're visiting today talking about pilgrimage, and Claire Sponskowski's dropped in to visit with us because we've all been on pilgrimage together and we all kind of have our own stories. But before we get into that, talking about just what pilgrimage is like, Mary, how do we look at pilgrimage? Give us a little definition. What is pilgrimage?
Sure. It's pilgrimage is about the journey. It's about the destination, but it's also about the journey to God. So it's different than a vacation. So on a pilgrimage, you enter into the life of Christ by following in the footsteps of Christ. So, for example, going to the Holy Land is the most obvious one, where you're actually literally walking in the footsteps of Christ. Sometimes those footsteps, following in those footsteps, is not real easy, though, which is sometimes what we call like the suffering of pilgrimage, or sometimes pilgrimage is not real easy, but it's entering into the life of Christ. When you go to other places that are significant in the life of Christ, such as Rome, or different Marian apparition sites, or things like this, you're entering into the sacred. And you know what? That brings a lot of joy when you're there, but it also it gives you the grace to move on in your life, to go forward with things maybe that you're struggling with or petitions that you bring with you. So there's lots of great graces when you go on pilgrimage.
I want to read from the Catechism. This is paragraph 1674. I ran across under popular piety. I thought it was so. Besides sacramental liturgy and sacramentals, catechesis must take into account the forms of piety and popular devotions among the faithful. The religious sense of the Christian people has always found expression in various forms of piety surrounding the Church's sacramental life, such as the veneration of relics, visits to sanctuaries, pilgrimages, processions, the Stations of the Cross, religious dances, the rosary, medals. There's the list here, right?
Right.
And so talking about how this has been part of the history of our faith is pilgrimage, because we recognize, right, in the Catechism also, that creation was made in a state of journeying, which is a pilgrimage.
Right.
So talk about that, it's really, pilgrimage is part of the sacramental life of the church.
Right. And as you said, it's the journey. So our life is a pilgrimage. I mean, we know that too. Our destination is heaven, right? Life is not always easy. But there's something about the journey, the going to. So it's not about a conquest. It's about surrendering yourself. So when you're traveling, you're surrendering your comforts of your own home, right? Your routines. Sometimes you're missing family events. I know on pilgrimage once I had to miss my grandmother's funeral. I was in Rome with a group of youth when she died, and I had to offer that up. Now, one thing, she died the morning we had Mass in St. Peter's Basilica in the Polish chapel. My grandmother was Polish, so that was, just a great grace myself, but I did get to miss her funeral. So yeah, about the journey, you give up your comforts, you experience new cultures, new food, a new different way of doing things. But there is something about getting away from the regular routine, things that you're attached to, especially things that bring you away from Christ. And it's like you have this clean slate to sort of like begin anew, or just to enjoy the journey and move towards Christ when you're on pilgrimage.
And it's so much like retreat, right? Pilgrimage is like retreat, like you said, stepping away and starting clean.
Exactly.
So I want to focus on just yesterday at the Sunday Mass. I want to focus on some of the readings from the Mass, and of course, so the psalm from yesterday was from Psalm 126, and the psalm was, "The Lord has done great things for us; we are filled with joy." Now, I know that in pilgrimage, we're not always filled with joy, right? Sometimes we have differing experiences in our pilgrimage. Claire, you want to share with us a little bit about some of your experiences on pilgrimage?
Yeah, so when I went to Rome with my family and Mary, I got really sick over the plane ride, mostly because I didn't eat well, but then caught a bug in some airport, and was just sick the entire time I was there. So any of the cultural food I was excited to taste, or things like that, were not exciting anymore. And I don't know, it became it kind of stayed throughout the whole trip. So it was just a kind of a sacrifice for walking and going places and needing to be kind of go on some parts of the trip. So
And Mary, we recognize that oftentimes we very often tell people a pilgrimage means some things are going to go well and some things are going to go poorly. So be
Right,
prepared to adjust and to rely on the grace of the Lord to make it through this pilgrimage.
Exactly. And we all have a different expectation before we go on pilgrimage, especially to a different country for the first time. I know before this, Claire was talking about her expectations, and you want to share your what you thought of Rome before you arrived there. Or?
Yeah, so I mean, I only knew Europe, I guess, from the movies where there's a fancy airplane you go over in, and then you land, and it's beautiful, and you drink champagne, and you're beautiful, and everything is just lovely over there compared to normal America. But getting over there, I realized they don't have the same plugins that we have. They don't have the same, like sometimes you have to pay for the toilets there. Just like it kind of felt like compared to that, America was actually the luxury, and it wasn't as bougie as I expected it to be. So some days, some mornings, it's kind of like you get up and you get ready bare minimum, but you don't get to make your hair like I like to do, or get dressed up and pretty for the day. It's kind of like you get up early, you go to mass, and then you're out on the streets of Rome and going to the next church. And sometimes it didn't feel like I was all put together by the time I got to that church. And that was another sacrifice or something, just like pushed to the back of my mind, because it's not important. It's where I'm going to that's more important right now. So that was
So how did you experience the beauty then on those sites?
Like I said, I wasn't feeling well most of the trip, so sometimes on the walks there, it was just like, I don't know if I want to go back to the apartment and sleep and things like that. And so sometimes getting there I really had to push myself to want to walk all the way to the church. But once I got to the church, usually it was by God's grace, I started to feel better. But then also just the awe of the place and the beauty of our Catholic faith in like every stone of those buildings. Usually it was like worth everything that it had taken to get there. One thing that I thought was so cool about Rome and Assisi and some of the other places we visited was that they'd all been storybook places before. Just things I heard about that existed, and that some of the greatest saints had been here. But then being there just felt much like suddenly my Catholic faith was much more tangible, and kind of like I could be a hero of that story too. In that way, like the saints, the heroes of those stories were real, and I'm now standing in the same place, and I could be that hero. And that just felt like so, like an epic story where suddenly the theme is playing in your head, and you're like, I'm in it, and I could be that. So, I mean, I think that usually helped me bring myself out of, any other little complaints I had during the pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Well, and going back to Psalm 126, the Lord has done great things for us. We are filled with joy. That's an experience there too.
Mhm.
But I would also say this, Mary and Claire, that some of the pilgrimages that I've been on, it's not till after the pilgrimage that I really start to unpack it, especially if you've been sick that entire time. It's afterwards, going back, if you've taken some pictures, and of course you got the pictures of your memory, that I've found that's sometimes the best part, especially in my prayer life. Did you experience that, where you came back and you could go back and look and go, wow, there's some great things that I now can bring into my daily prayer life?
Yeah. One of them for sure that keeps coming back was in Siena, which I didn't think would really impact me as much, but we went to stand outside as the sun was going down in Siena, and I just imagined this is what Catherine Siena might have seen into her prayer life and her walk with Christ. And that scene comes back to me in prayer with the Lord, where it's just like he was right there for Catherine, and he's right there for me. And just this, he's in every moment sort of reminder. There's also another time in one of the churches, I think it was, I can't remember the name now, but it was in Rome. And there was one time where I got really wiped out from just walking around, and I had to sit down, and I thought, like, I wanted to go see this cool side chapel and this cool side chapel, but I couldn't make it because I needed a breather. I was feeling dizzy. And I sat down, And I looked up, and directly in my eye line, right across from me, was a side chapel that had the Eucharist exposed. It was the monstrance right there. And it was like he was looking right at me, even though I was, wiped out. And I thought that I was, kind of hiding, or like I'm not getting to my destination. He's like, he met me right there in my pilgrimage. And I still remember that to the day too, where sometimes I just sit down and I'm tired, and I realize I like look up and remember that moment where he was looking right at me. And yeah, those are the two moments, I guess, that come to my mind in prayer when I'm in America.
Yeah, I gotta say, because I was with Claire on this pilgrimage, and I remember feeling bad for her every day because I knew she didn't feel well, and the food, and she looked tired. And I just thought after we got home, I'm like, oh, I wonder if she'll ever want to go again. And we mentioned it again to her, and she lit up like a light bulb and said yes right away. I was like, okay, the Lord worked in all of that, even through the suffering, the rainy days, and we're dressed properly and not feeling well and things like that. But the Lord works in that. Sometimes that's where the great graces come in as well.
Yeah, I would say that on pilgrimage, it's the challenges that you kind of remember more.
Yeah.
And I know myself, we were in Rome here a number of weeks ago, and that sense at some certain point, my feet started hurting, and I'm like, Lord, I'm sorry. I'm not good at suffering, but I know I'm here, and it's on pilgrimage, and I know that you've got me here. So you have to help me try to, and so I would notice like the moments when the pain would go away, like, I'd be like, thank you so much that I can walk now without pain. And then it's like, it's back, Lord, what are we doing here? But
Right.
but I think it actually brings you into regular conversation with the Lord, constant conversation with him.
Yeah,
and I think that's what I find myself on pilgrimage. I feel like more often I'm in constant conversation with him, less with the people I'm walking with, but more with him, because I'm like, okay, what are we doing here?
I could tell you I'm on conversation with him constantly when I have a group, because I'm always worrying about the group. Our last trip, we went to a small town called Cortona, and we were just going to go to the top, see the basilica, and then hike down and have lunch in the town. I was really looking forward to this restaurant, and then we were going to head out after that. I'd only been there, twice before, but one other time with a group where we hiked down, and it was beautiful scenery. It's a hilltop town. So we get up there all the way to the top, and it's pea soup. You can't even see outside across the parking lot. And I'm thinking, like, how is this group going to walk down the hill? It could be slippery. It could be you can't see in front of you. And I can get a taxi for some people, but there's no cars in the center of this town. So, so in the beginning, the group started to walk while I was getting other people in the taxi, and they came back. Steve was one of them, said, no way, it's too icy. And I sat there like, now what do I do, Lord? I've got this group at the top of the hill. The taxi just left, and our bus can't really go down. He left anyway. And so we worked it out to walk part of the road down in this misty pea soup fog. We had to have umbrellas out. It's kind of rainy a little bit. So we walked down, and we met, we were able to get back into the town part way and stop and see churches, but I absolutely loved it. There's something so quaint about it, or quiet in that pea soup. I don't know. And I heard that from other pilgrims too, that they're like, okay, we really liked that a lot. That was just stopping in an old medieval church that, you can tell looks like no one's been in for years and no one else is around, I loved that. So
I thought it was funny too, almost like the presence of the Lord. I'm not a cat fan, but when we got to that first chapel, suddenly this cat shows up, and then that cat walked in front of us for most of the rest of the journey.
Yeah, he kind of led us. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, the Lord sent his personal cat. I mean, obviously we know that sometimes the Lord can show up as a symbol of his presence to us. And I thought that was just funny how this cat just, like,
it really would look back at us and kind of be like, go this way. Like, okay.
Yeah, it was just kind of funny how that the Lord did provide in that moment.
Yeah, and the pea soup of walking in Cortona.
Isn't that the symbol chosen in that C.S. Lewis uses often, like in The Horse and His Boy? Shasta gets led through the desert by a cat, and then turns into a lion, Aslan, things like that.
I didn't even
very cool.
make that connection.
Yeah.
There you go. That's awesome. Cool. So let's going back to the readings yesterday. The second reading was from Philippians 3, and Claire, I'm going to have you read that from Scripture for us. Just it's actually the end of the reading that I just wanted to point out.
Just one thing, forgetting what lies behind, but straining forward to what lies ahead. I continue my pursuit toward the goal, the prize of God's upward calling in Christ Jesus.
I think that's pilgrimage, is that sometimes you have to stop and you have to forget what lies behind and focus
Mhm.
on what lies ahead. It's not just a pilgrimage, it's our life
Our
is a
life.
pilgrimage,
Right, right.
right?
Yeah.
We have to do that. And especially in pilgrimage, to focus on, okay, this has been my life, but now the Lord has a path for me moving ahead. Or even when you're not feeling well, I just have to take the next step.
Right.
I think that's a great reminder of pilgrimage, how it really relates to our daily life.
Yeah, it reminds me of Saint Junipero motto, which is always forward. I love that motto. Yeah, and even with like right now we're in a Jubilee year, so the Jubilee doors are open, and the doors, Christ is the door. So our destination of walking through that door is sort of leaving behind things that we're attached to, things that we just don't need to carry with us, and beginning anew as we enter into the sacred. Like things are going to change, Lord. I'm going to walk this journey with you. You are the door. I enter through you. I leave all the baggage behind.
Yeah, it's a great reminder. Claire, you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on anything you'd mentioned too, that the taking one step at a time on a pilgrimage and just focusing, and even one day at a time, maybe sometimes 1 minute at a time,
Yeah,
right? And anything that kind of stands out to you as you think about the pilgrimages you've been on, or looking forward to the next pilgrimage you're going to be on.
Yeah. I know that Mary mentioned that my face lit up when you mentioned a trip, but interiorly I freaked out. Like I didn't really want to in my head. But I guess taking the one step at a time was more focusing on, well, I'll get the tickets. I'll make sure that I eat well before the airplane. I'll, do all these things, and basically I didn't have the courage to go on a pilgrimage, but I can make those choices before. So I was like, well, I can start choosing to go on this pilgrimage, and hopefully by the time I get on the airplane, I'll be okay. Because I started to have this fear of just like overseas makes me sick.
Yeah, the
Rome makes
fear
me
came
sick.
in suddenly of like,
Yep.
wait a minute, I remember my plane ride.
Yep.
And
Yep. And
therefore,
it's-
every plane ride is going to be like that.
Yep.
And yeah.
Yep. And that
Right.
and you
Yeah, you gotta
associate
get past
sickness.
that.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
that trip, our flight got canceled in Atlanta. We had to sleep on the floor in the
Yeah.
airport.
Yeah,
We
that
were
doesn't
all
help.
not feeling well after that.
Yep.
Right.
So that's something learning. Never sleep
Right.
on the floor in the airport.
Yeah.
It's just not a good idea. They
Right.
give you napkins to cover up with, because they
Yeah.
call them, because like they were blankets, but they were the thickness of napkins. And all the kids
Right.
were like,
Right.
what are we supposed to do with these napkins?
Blow our nose.
And it was cold.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Yeah.
those things kind of, but again, it was a sacrifice.
Yeah.
That we had to make, but you also can learn from that in the future, let's try to avoid that, or whatever, have
Right,
a
yeah.
different solution. And I think
One of my tricks, well, especially when I'm flying during flu season, so I wear gloves on the airplane and I don't touch anything in the airports, or I am kind of paranoid about that. Even when we get to Rome, like I always have gloves on in the metros, the subways, or the buses, or I'm kind of like, okay, just do the things that I know that kind of protect myself from getting sick, because it is miserable to get sick when you're away from home anywhere, versus pilgrimage versus vacation anywhere else. But yeah.
So we are continuing on our conversation here using the readings from the Mass. The Gospel was from John 8, of course, the familiar story of the woman caught in adultery. But I want to focus more on the beginning of that Gospel there. So in chapter 8, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, but early in the morning he arrived again in the temple area, and all the people started coming to him, and he sat down and taught them. As we're talking about evangelization, again, we often talk about these three phases or steps, and it doesn't mean that we just go 1, 2, 3 and never back. Sometimes you go, through the different steps, but the step of encounter of Christ, then being formed in our identity, knowing who we are, and then going on mission. And so, Christ came in, he taught them, right? He came and he found that they were there, and he sat down and taught them. What are things we can learn on pilgrimage, Mary? I mean, obviously there's great
obviously
catechesis
there's a
that
lot,
goes on.
but actually it's a lot of the formation happens before you go on pilgrimage. It makes a big difference to know the story of Saint Catherine of Siena before you go to Siena and stand in front of her tomb. If you have no idea who she is, it's just another saint, and there's thousands and thousands of saints. So being formed on what is pilgrimage, having the expectations like, okay, what is pilgrimage, first of all. 2, being formed and where am I going? Like, what is the history of St. Peter's Basilica? Or if you're doing local pilgrimages, instead of just dropping by the local church, that's the Jubilee Church this year, maybe read a little bit about the church. That does make a huge difference when you get there. Or a particular devotion. So like I have a great devotion to Saint Gemma Galgani. So when I got to her tomb in Lucca, Italy, I was just overwhelmed. I'm like, here she is. I've been reading her stories. I'm reading anybody else who wrote about her. I've prayed to her, all this kind of stuff. And I got there and I was almost like overwhelmed, like, here she is, God's masterpiece, That was awesome. So a lot of the formation really should happen before you go. That makes a huge difference in your experience. But at the same time, you're going to come across things that you didn't even know were in Rome, like I didn't know the saint was here or whatever. And so when you're there, again, just like realizing that Jesus wants to teach you while you're there. So it's not just some other saint. Maybe like look up the saint's story while you're there, or the history of this church, or, one of St. Peter's Basilica, I think I've told this story before. When I was there, they have different altars around the floor of the basilica. And when you walked in, there'd be priests all over the place having mass. So it was a constant mass in the morning, all different altars. And when I was there, we walked with this priest to have mass in one of those altars. And I had noticed the floor that the priest stands on had worn shoe marks. And I remember sitting there reflecting on that, like, how many priests have stood in this spot since, I'm assuming this board is from the new basilica, so 1500s, maybe 1600s, if it got replaced. It could even be from the old basilica. How many priests have stood there in this spot offering mass? Wow, that just took me back. I was up there taking pictures of the footmarks. I'm sure people were looking at, what did she take a picture of the board? But that stuck with me, and that was many years ago that I witnessed that. It was really moving to me.
Yeah, I think it is interesting too when you get into Rome and Italy, where things are not 200 years old.
Right, right.
They're thousands of years
Right,
old,
yeah.
and so you start to see this history unfold in front of you. It's just breathtaking.
It's not a textbook anymore. It's
Right,
in front of you.
right. So, and talking about this catechesis or formation that happens before you go Rome, I think the catechesis that you do before a pilgrimage actually enhances the catechesis that happens while you're there.
Right.
As an example, on our most recent trip to Rome, we had friends go along with us, and they said, we've seen the Caravaggio's before on the wall, but we've never seen them in their state in the church, or the Fra Angelicos. We've seen those before, but we've never seen them on the wall in the cells where they were actually painted originally. And it's completely different to see them in their original state than to see a lithograph of them on the wall.
Right.
There's a kind of a formation that goes there too. Like, this is real.
Right. Yeah, it's such a difference, right? I know, speaking of Cortona again, the first time we were in Cortona, I got to see Fra Angelico's piece, The Annunciation. He has 3 different ones. Now, granted, this was a museum, so not in its original church, but I was just overwhelmed with the colors and the gold jumping. You can't get that on a computer screen. It was like completely different. It's like I wanted to stay in front of it for a while and be memorized by it. But yes, there is something about seeing the context of these pictures in their original place where they're meant to be. It gives you a whole other catechesis about it as well. I mean, if you're standing in front of a piece of museum, you're missing part of the history of the piece, aren't you? Not seeing it in its original context. So yeah.
Well, talking about this year, of course, this is the Jubilee year, a year of pilgrimage. Pilgrims of Hope is the theme. And as pilgrims of hope, when we go on the pilgrimages, we walk through these doors. And these doors are really a sense of receiving forgiveness and mercy and extending that to others.
Yes.
And going back to the Mass, this past Sunday, of course, the story was about the woman caught in adultery. And of course, we know the story that Jesus bends down and starts writing in the sand. And then, he makes that statement, let the first among you who is without sin cast the first stone. And then he gets down and he starts writing again. And they all leave. And the woman caught in adultery says to Jesus, he says to her, are there none who condemn you? And she says, no. And he says, neither do I. In the future, avoid this sin, right? We know this is
go and sin no more.
Yeah, so paraphrasing. But I think that has something to do with, again, this year of Jubilee is a year of mercy. And for ourselves to, when we go on pilgrimage, to go with that sense of asking the Lord for mercy, but also asking him for the grace to be merciful to others. Talk
Right,
a little bit
right.
about that.
So, I talked about the baggage that we carry with us that we want to leave behind. That baggage, some of that baggage is our sins as well. And so there is this aspect of penance when you go on pilgrimage. That's why one of the requirements for the indulgence is to go to confession, actually. So you want to be penitent when you go on pilgrimage, especially during the medieval times. Pilgrimage was often assigned as a penance. And so they weren't little penances. They were like, go on foot for the next couple of weeks, get your life in order, because you might not make it back. I mean, some of them were that harsh, because you needed to make this a pilgrimage as a penance. But so there is that aspect of it, yeah, that you're emptying yourself out because you want to be filled with grace. In order to do that, you need to get rid of the sins, basically, and receive our Lord's mercy as we go towards him.
Absolutely. So as you consider whether you can go to Italy or if you're going on pilgrimage here around the Diocese of Fargo, remember, we've got numerous events this year. Let's talk a little bit about that too, Mary, where we've got Jubilee sites within the diocese where you can go and receive that plenary indulgence. We have a couple of things coming up this summer that people can be a part of in June, one in June and one in August.
Right. So first of all, we have 6 sites in the Diocese of Fargo, all designated as Jubilee pilgrim sites. And each site has their own unique Jubilee coin that you can collect as well, designed by that parish. So again, we have, I would say, do some formation before you leave. Get to know these sites. On our diocesan website, we have some information about, we have like a pilgrim guide. So a little bit of information about the history of those places that you're going to go to in the diocese. So get to know the history of St. Michael's Church or Little Flower in Rugby. Why is it named Little Flower? I bet for those of you who love St. Therese can probably guess there was a novena said there to build that church. So on your own, yes, please go out. There is a poster with a QR code that you should log in with your phone. And if you go to all the sites, you can collect the Diocese Jubilee coin. But I have to see those. And I've been seeing a lot every week come in. So it's great seeing all the people going around doing pilgrimage. But if you'd like to go, let's say you don't want to drive, you go by yourself. We have a bus trip at the end of August. It's 2 days and we hit every site. Starts at Maryvale and ends at Maryvale. You can check our website for that information. We also have a replica of the Shroud of Turin coming in. It will be at St. Mary's Cathedral in Fargo. And for those going on the 2-day trip, you'll have reserved seating for our presentation, where we're bringing in an expert on the shroud. But the shroud exhibit itself will be there all week in the social hall. You can come down and visit and see this exact replica and some other informational panels. We also have a pilgrimage called the Corpus Christi Camino. So Camino means the way. Some of you might be familiar with the Camino in Santiago, Spain. So it's you can either do a month of walking, or I think it's 7 or 8 days of walking. Recently, Monsignor Schlosserman and Monsignor Gehring had done pilgrimage on the Camino last September. I think they did 8 or 9 days. I can't remember. But it's a journey of walking and basically sleeping, getting up the next day and walking and carrying everything on your back. So, but we are going to make it a little bit more easier. It's just going to be a 3-day Camino. We're going to start in Daisy, North Dakota, and camp overnight on the campgrounds or the church grounds there. And then do, I think it's 16-mile hike the first day. But there'll be a lunch break in the middle there. And for those who can't make the 16 miles halfway, we can drive you over to the campground. And then we'll stay at a very nice campground that evening, and then hike about 8 miles the next day, stay overnight at Maryvale on the grounds, camping, and then breakfast and mass the next day. So yeah, and this is the North American Trail, North Country Trail that we'll be hiking along. So that should be a lot of fun too. So yeah, great. A lot of opportunities coming up here, Steve.
Absolutely. You can check all that out. That information is all available at fargodiocese.org/Jubilee, or you can also go to the Maryvale website, maryvalend.org. It's all that information is available on both those sites. We'd love to see you at any of those events. Again, pilgrimage. This is the Jubilee year, a great year to really focus on receiving the mercy of the Lord. And also being filled with that ability to offer and extend that mercy to others.
Yes. Everybody, you know what? This is the year to go on pilgrimage, especially with those Jubilee sites around the diocese. It doesn't take much. If you can get to church, you can go to at least one of the sites, I think, in the diocese. So everybody should be going on pilgrimage this year.
So we'll see you on pilgrimage.
Yes.